Hello and welcome back to Scrap Mechanic Hide and Seek Spot Guides. Today we're going to take a look at the museum map, which is not only my most popular map, but also the reason why this series exists. And that's because this Seeker minigame was apparently so hard that people requested I make a video to prove or disprove the existence of the minigame switches. So let me just show you that they do exist, and by now I've made some changes to the map that should make them a little bit easier to spot, which is these small ducks that I've put looking sort of towards more or less where the switches are. And that might make them too easy. Still not sure if I want to keep them or not, because the minigame is intended to be hard. But if you can't find anything, then it's also not what it was supposed to be. It's not just supposed to be a waste of time. So we'll see what I go with. But anyway, when you find all of the switches, this elevator switch becomes available and lifts you up and gives you a glimpse at the map while people might potentially still be hiding. I intentionally placed this window at a little bit of an awkward height so that you're not just seeing everything immediately, for the same reason that I want the switches to be hard but not extremely hard. Also, I'm kind of surprised that nobody seemed to have found the spot that is right next to the Seeker area, even though it closes when you load in the map, so you can actually see it close when you load up the map the first time. But this is kind of a cool spot where you can just watch the Seeker wait in his cubicle or run around trying to find the switches in the minigame. So yeah, one thing I tried to improve on this map is the mix of gimme versus hard switches, but it didn't quite turn out as the improvement that I was hoping for, which I think is mostly due to the size of the map in relation to how many switches there is on it, because it leads to a lot of areas that you would think have switches not actually having switches, which is something that I kind of like doing, just so that you don't always know where to look for a switch. But at a certain scale, it makes it harder than a switch would be, because some of these are not all that hidden, but still take a decent amount of time to find if you don't know where they are. Another thing you're going to notice on this map is how I reused some of the assets of my earlier map, and that's going to be a continuing theme for almost all of the maps, because on one hand it offers a nice tie together things and makes it a little bit more recognizable, and on the other hand, if you've already made an asset, especially if it's a complicated asset, it saves you a lot of time if you can just use the blueprint again for a new map without just placing it all over the place and making the same map twice. So I like doing that. You can kind of also see it with these trees, because it's more or less just the same tree turned and sculpted slightly differently, placed all over the place, so I don't have to design 53s. This spot was also an interesting spot because it's kind of a gigantic moving piece that doesn't all need to be moving, but I'd already built and colored in all of the fountain, and I did not want to have to reconstruct it too much to be able to only move the fountain. And it's kind of nice that the consequence is that you can clip through the camera through all of the hiding spot. But on the other hand, the way that it was originally integrated actually caused more lag than it needed to. And this map in general is, I believe, my most laggy map. But I've tried to make improvements on that in some patches. I don't know how much it helped. I never experience any lag on my maps when I make them, but then I also don't play them in multiplayer, so that's probably a different story. Now, something I like doing is finding different ways to allow the hider to troll the Seeker. And in the last map, I tried using the spot gun holes to do that, which I don't think worked as well as intended. In this map, although only very sparingly, I tried to put gimmicks into the hiding spots, like in this spot where you can control objects in the room that the Seeker is looking for you in. But I feel like I could have made more of those, and I still haven't found the way that I enjoy the most to be able to troll Seekers with. But it's still something that I keep trying to integrate in maps than as much as now. Also, something that I feel gets a little bit lost on large maps is, and that might be kind of counterintuitive, but the element of exploration, like even trying to find the switch on top of this bone by jumping to it, because the map is so large and has so many things you can explore that you're not likely to actually find a lot of the smaller, more detailed exploration gimmicks to get into, over, or onto things. Which is one of the reasons why I think this homage spot with the suspension mug got missed in the videos that I've seen. Another thing that I've seen people talk about is that they thought these kinds of areas would also be spots, but actually a lot of those that you can see, especially under the fossils, are not spots. They just exist because I've not created those in the most optimal way, which is that before the controllers move out of the limbs into the correct positions, they actually just point straight down, which means they have more height to them than they would otherwise have in the finished product, which means a lot of them would just glitch into the floor if I wouldn't make the floor move out of the way first and then close a couple seconds after you load the map, which is also somehow related to why the Longneck spot is down until you start a challenge, because it also was not consistent. I wanted it to start in the upright position, but it just didn't always do that unless I had it in the down position and then turned it on to raise itself when you start the challenge. Now, this is also another good example of exploring the more detailed sections of areas that you can or cannot get to. But luckily this one was found. I really like this spot. And the fact that you have to consider going on top of that fossil to even find it is the kind of the jump, but not like, it's not a complicated jumping puzzle, but I like making these kinds of jumping gimmicks, I guess might be the right word for it. Now this spot actually had some issues, which I've also tried to patch out, because I did not consider what happens if you just take the toilet up before closing the spot behind you. But I've just put another switch there now, so that if you do that, you can push it out of the way before you try to leave the spot. But the actual intended spot for this is just in this tower, because you can't get in from the outside unless you open that door. Now also the spot on the roof that I just shot at used to have a overhanging roof section that I just simply didn't see that I placed it wrong. Which, especially on these larger maps, I do just tend to make more mistakes because there's so many things to do, and even though I try to double check a lot of them, you always end up missing something. Now in this spot, there's actually the rare spot within the spot that was also missed in the NPM videos, which is kind of sad. It would have been kind of cool if they saw that, but it's also a very hard spot within a spot. And then right after this, we get the infamous pot spot or vase spot or whatever you want to call it, which just sparked a gigantic discussion. And then maybe even more infamous is this Longneck spot that they spent so long finding. And I'm a little bit sad because, well, I'm a little bit mixed, I guess, because I'm glad they ended up finding the spot, but actually the way that they managed to get into it is not the way that I originally intended for you to get into it. I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that you could only actually reach and see that switch when you're standing on the Longneck looking up at the right angle into the vertebrae. But apparently I missed some areas that you were able to see it in, and I'm kind of glad that at least they got to see the spot. However, contrary to what they thought, it's not actually the most OP spot, because there's actually a spot that leads, like a spot within a spot from this spot, more or less. Also, scrap mechanic lighting is weird. I attached a lighting switch to this head, and even though it's only supposed to toggle the lights directly above you, lights in the distance that aren't actually turning on or off somehow get displayed as on or off regardless of that, which is strange. But anyway, if you exit the Longneck while it is raised, you can actually find a switch hidden in the ceiling that leads you out of the museum. And then if you turn around and you find another switch you can actually access the outside glass wall that surrounds everything. And this spot is kind of the reason why it even exists, because without just everything being walled, this spot would be very obvious, not to find, but to know that it is even there in the first place. And it actually leads to the empty display case in the center, which I've also seen people wondering about how you get into this. And this is, in my opinion, the most OP spot in this map. And that was the intention to it. In fact, the original design intention of this entire map was supposed to be that the entire museum is just full of empty display cases, and the hiders are supposed to turn themselves into exhibits, and the switches would just be not near any of the display cases. But I feel like the museum would have ended up looking too boring, so that's why I changed it. I also made a little bit of a architectural mistake, I guess, when designing this, in that I did not leave myself any space for spots in the walls. So the tower, the small like spire sections, I guess, is the only real places that you can hide in the walls. Same thing goes for the floor in between ground floor and upper floor. Obviously there's space below ground floor, but there's not in between the floors, so it's very hard to fit any spots anywhere, which is something that I've definitely learned from in the future. Also, the roof spot that we just saw a couple seconds ago, you might think you can get to that another way, but the roof section above the main hall is actually too high to jump to from any of the other roof sections, so you do need to find the spot within a spot from the Longneck to be able to get to that. Now, this toilet spot is also another controversial spot, because if the hider sits on the toilet, the seeker will never be able to get into the spot, which I didn't really think about, but also I didn't really like all of the workarounds that were possible to solve this. So I decided to just leave it as is and hope that the players just play the game fairly, because in the end they're trying to have fun and not just over the top troll everybody, I guess. I mean, maybe some people are, but yeah. This is also kind of a misleading spot, because it has the open hole into the other room, but you can't actually get through that hole, so you have to get in from the backside. And then another spot that I really like is this generator spot, where you have to turn on the power to enable the door to even open in the first place. I had a little bit of a dilemma with this, because if you don't use the signal lights to showcase that it's somehow connected to the generator, I feel like nobody would have ever found this, because if you don't know that you have to switch on the power for this, how are you supposed to understand that? But then when you put the lights on it, it's also very obvious that that's what you're supposed to do. And I just couldn't find a nice way to make this more subtle without making it just too impossible. So I decided to just leave it on the easier side, and I feel like it worked out kind of okay. Another spot that tends to cause some problems is this spot, not because of the switch location itself, but how you get to the point where you can reach the switch. And that's just because sometimes grab mechanics likes to behave weird when you jump towards wedges. So I recommend in situations like that you try different points that you might be able to reach, and preferably some that don't have wedges behind them, making the jump infinitely easier to get to. Now, something else I did in this map a little bit, that I then didn't do at all in the next map, but then I've started to integrate this more in the newer maps, is like you just saw right there, in some of the hiding spots you actually see the other hiding spots, which doesn't tell you how to get into them, but you know that they're there, and you can try to figure out from that where's the area that I can get into them. But obviously you need to pay enough attention to even notice them in the first place. Also, this spiral staircase, by the way, is definitely another reason why this map is a little bit more laggy than the others, since all of these are just touching each other the entire time. And they don't need to be. It looks cooler this way, but I found better ways of integrating this in future maps. But yeah, that's it. That's the museum map. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be making more videos like this on all of my other maps. So if you did enjoy it, feel free to come back. And until then, bye-bye.